The 1990s is a decade that's become iconic for many reasons. The music of the time inspired many of today's most famous artists. The fashion style was very unique, and many of the global events that took place during that time shaped the world into what it is today. But as with any other decade, it was also marked by strange and disturbing events that are still spoken about today, and many of these cases will live on in our memories forever. Number 10. On the 2nd of April, 1991, the Pinatubo volcano, which is located in the Philippines, ended its long stretch of dormancy when it started erupting, changing the lives of thousands of people living in the area forever. The volcano had laid dormant for so long that the forests had started growing over it, and in the months before the eruption, the area had been experiencing earthquakes that foretold what was about to occur. On that day, the magma under the earth came into contact with the water's surface, and the pressure under the mountain rose to uncontainable levels. This caused the northern side of the mountain to finally give way, and the eruption began. Initially, the volcano didn't pose too much of a threat, and scientists arrived in the area to collect as much data as they could. They found that several more earthquakes had taken place, and that sulfur was reaching the surface. By the end of May of that year, sulfur levels had increased dramatically, as many as 10 times compared to the first readings. But these levels then suddenly dropped, which led experts to believe that something was blocking the way of the snow-trapped gases. This was a worrying sign, since this underground buildup needed to be vented in one way or another, and it would likely end in a larger eruption. In the weeks that followed, a few small eruptions occurred, but on the 15th of June, the mountain finally unleashed its full power. The gases that had been trapped underground forced their way through the Earth's surface, and the resulting explosion forced close to 6 square miles of debris into the stratosphere. This continued for a full 9 hours, and eventually the entire mountain disintegrated. A massive amount of ash was released by the volcano, and it started falling on nearby settlements and villages. Many people reported that their roofs collapsed under the weight of the debris. And while the initial impact on human life was limited thanks to precautions that had been taken, it would get much worse in the years to come. The ash mixed with rainfall, and the result was floods containing debris from the mountain. These floods destroyed houses, displacing thousands of people, and wreaked havoc on the entire surrounding area. Geologists determined that it was the biggest eruption that had taken place for more than a century, and thanks to the ash that had been ejected into the air, the quality of light from the sun was affected for the next 5 days. This caused the area to experience a 0.5 average drop in temperature, and eventually it impacted the ozone layer, reducing it by as much as 25%. It would have an impact on the entire planet's temperature, as the atmosphere was heated by about 3.5%. It's been estimated that thanks to the preventative measures that were put in place before the eruption, about 5,000 people were saved, and around $250 million in damage was curtailed. Had seismologists not been present or failed to recognize the warning signs, the local population would have been decimated. Number 9. Most of us are familiar with Woodstock, the music and art fair that was held on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York from the 15th to the 18th of August in 1969. This event has become a massive part of music history, which is why another Woodstock festival was held in 1994, and again in 1999 in Rome, New York. But it ended very differently than the original event. According to most accounts, the 1969 Woodstock Festival was held in good spirits, with most people just out to have a good time while listening to their favorite artists and bands. Most of the fans attending the 1999 version, which was held from the 23rd to the 25th of July of that year, set out to do just that, but it quickly deteriorated into a very different atmosphere. Many people described that as soon as they arrived at the venue, they immediately became aware of a terrible smell. Fans could be seen slipping in muddy conditions, and soon it became apparent this was not just mud, since many of the bathroom facilities had started overflowing due to the sheer number of people in attendance. According to many media outlets, the start of the last day of Woodstock 99 was something akin to a post-apocalyptic film. Mud and trash covered the ground as far as the eye could see, and those who were awake in the early morning were doing their best to combat hangovers from the previous day, and were very sunburned. The previous day saw heavy-hitting performers hit the stage, including Rage Against the Machine, Limp Bizkit, and Metallica. Many of the security guards who'd been employed for the event had quit, either because they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, or to join in on the fun. One guard would later state that when he arrived for his shift on the afternoon of the final day, he knew something would go wrong, since the tension in the air was palpable. The previous night, police officers and paramedics had been pelted with rocks, and they described it as similar to a battlefield. By that evening, tensions were at an all-time high when the Red Hot Chili Peppers took the stage. They played for about an hour and were well received, but when they left the stage to get ready for their encore, the barrier between the stage and the crowd gave way. A large fire had been set in one section of the crowd, and as an act of irony, the band played a cover of the Jimi Hendrix song Fire, with the singer Anthony Kiedis remarking that it looked like Apocalypse Now in the crowd. Before long, more than a dozen fires were set. Vendors' trailers were targeted, and the fires were fueled thanks to the thousands of pizza boxes and all the other trash that was lying around. Metal barrels were used as drums while these blazes continued, and when all was said and done, more than $1 million worth of damage was reported. Quite unbelievably, the festival organizers were mostly unaware of the chaos that had been brewing since the night before, and it would only be during the eventual press conference that they would be made aware of the deplorable conditions, as well as the anarchic behavior that the festival is now remembered for. Number 8. When families decide to spend the day together at a water park, they envision a day filled with laughter, sunshine, and good times. And while this is usually the case, an incident that took place on the 2nd of June 1997 resulted in that day ending very differently than expected. The incident in question took place at Six Flags Water World in Concord, California, and by the end of that day, one person had lost their life while many others were badly injured. In attendance was a group of students from Napa High School who were on their annual senior class trip to the park, and they were determined to set a new record. In previous years, students had participated in an activity called clogging, in which they would squeeze as many people into a water slide as possible. They would do this by pushing their legs to one side of the slide in order to make room for others. At the time, the existing record stood at 76 people, though this was accomplished at a different venue. It would seem logical to most of us that this would be an extremely dangerous thing to do, but the students were determined to reach their goal. Lifeguards at the park were aware of clogging and had warned several students to refrain from the activity or face being thrown out. But as closing time neared, the students felt that being kicked out wouldn't have much of an impact on their day, and they started ignoring these warnings. A group started to form at the 40-foot-high bonsai pipeline, and when word was given, they all piled into the slide, with dozens of students now stuck in the slide. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And just moments later, the true danger of the situation became all too clear. The slide collapsed under the weight of the students, and they started tumbling to the ground 40 feet below. One teacher who was standing on the sidelines described the horror that he witnessed as he saw people flying through the air before landing hard on the ground moments later. Some students ended up in trees, while others fell onto rocks and concrete below. The slide had been subjected to more than 3 times its allowed capacity, and it was eventually calculated that about 30 people were involved. Some students clung to the support beams, while others fell onto their friends who'd already hit the ground. One student, a graduating senior named Quimby Galati, was struck in the head by a falling wooden pole, and she lost her life. Those who were not involved in the record-breaking attempt rushed to the aid of those who'd fallen, and did their best to administer first aid. Bystanders notified the authorities, and before long, ambulances started to arrive to treat the injured. At least 3 students were taken to the hospital in critical condition, and others were taken by helicopter to 9 different hospitals in the surrounding area, where they eventually recovered. The group's graduation ceremony went ahead as scheduled, but was said to be far more somber thanks to the memory of Quimby Galati losing her life that day. Number 7. 23-year-old Selena Quintanilla Perez became known during the 1990s as one of the decade's foremost Tejano performers. That style of music incorporates a fast-paced Latin dance style that became very popular with the Hispanic community living in South Texas at the time. And before long, Selena became a music icon. She was given the nickname the Queen of Tejano, but she was slated to become even more famous since she was on the verge of releasing her first ever English-language album called Dreaming of You. But she would never get the chance to see the success of this album, as she lost her life on the 31st of March, 1995, and it was cut short by someone whom she believed she could trust, but the reality was far more sinister than she could have imagined. In 1995, Selena had won a Grammy Award for the Best Mexican-American Album, and she played her last show to 67,000 fans on the 26th of February that year, though she could never have imagined it would be her final performance. Trouble had started brewing in Selena's camp when she became aware of irregularities with her finances. She and her family realized that the president of her fan club, a woman named Yolanda Saldivar, had been embezzling money from the singer, and they decided to confront her on the matter. This was done during a meeting that was held on the 2nd of March of that year, and while Saldivar denied any wrongdoing, the evidence against her was clear, and the decision was made to fire her from the position. She then spoke to Selena weeks later and asked if they could meet. Selena agreed and set the meeting date for the 31st of that month, but unbeknownst to the singer, Saldivar had already purchased a firearm and was intending to use it. The pair met at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi, Texas, where Saldivar was supposed to hand over financial documents that she had in her possession, in which she'd refused to hand over at the initial meeting. But as was expected, the meeting soon degraded into a full-blown argument, and when Selena decided to leave, Saldivar produced the firearm and discharged it, hitting the singer in the shoulder blade from behind. Selena realized she was in trouble, and she started running to the motel lobby, but Saldivar followed closely behind, intent on finishing what he had started. Selena made it to the hotel lobby, and after calling out for aid, collapsed to the floor. Motel staff called for an ambulance, and they did all they could to help her, and in the meantime, Saldivar returned to a room that she had rented. Luckily, just as she was about to lose consciousness, Selena was able to explain who had attacked her, and stated which room Saldivar was staying in, number 158. She was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, she lost her life later that afternoon, as surgeons were unable to repair the damage that had been done. Saldivar made her way to her pickup truck where she was confronted by police, which resulted in a tense 9-hour standoff. She claimed that the incident was an accident, but she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty, but was eventually sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Number 6. During the 1990s, Angel Resendez was no stranger to the wrong side of the law. He was a drifter who'd been arrested and put in jail many times, mostly in Florida and New Mexico. But unbeknownst to the police, he'd committed far worse crimes than they were aware of. Resendez immigrated to the US from Durango in Mexico in 1976, and soon after his arrival, he started working on a farm. He had a difficult childhood as he suffered physical abuse at home, and on one occasion he ran away and spent several weeks living on the streets. When he turned 16, he tried to cross into Texas illegally, but he was caught and sent back to Mexico. When he eventually immigrated legally, he quickly found himself in trouble for burglary, assault, auto theft, and the illegal possession of a firearm. He spent a lot of time in prison and would repeatedly be deported, but he somehow always managed to make his way back into the US. This is a pattern that repeated itself for as many as 11 years. He eventually married a woman named Julieta Dominguez Reyes, and they had a daughter together. But no one was aware that he was living a nefarious double life, which started in 1986 when he ended the lives of a homeless couple for reasons unknown. By 1999, he ended the lives of 33-year-old Michael White while he was in Kentucky. And to keep a low profile, he traveled by train, since he could easily cross over state lines undetected. In 1997, he ended the lives of 4 people, including Jesse Howell and Wendy Von Heuben in Ocala, Florida, Christopher Mayer in Lexington, Kentucky, and an unidentified homeless man in Colton, California. He also assaulted a woman named Holly Dunn and may have believed that she was no longer alive, but she managed to survive the attack. In 1998, he ended the lives of Leafy Mason in Hughes Springs, Texas, and Claudia Benton in Western University Place, Texas. The following year, he committed 6 more murders, that of Norman and Karen Cernick, Naomi Dominguez, Josephine Convica, George Morber Sr., and Carolyn Frederick. The police eventually linked these cases to one another and knew that they were on the hunt for a serial killer. Most of the crimes had been committed near railway lines, but since Resendez lived a transient lifestyle, he was very hard to track down. He became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, and he was eventually arrested after his sister convinced him to hand himself over to the authorities. At his trial, he pleaded guilty by reason of insanity, since he believed he was an angel of God who was sent to kill the evil people of the world. But his ploy failed, and Resendez was found guilty and given the death penalty. Number 5. Usually, when a serial killer is caught, it's because they made a mistake during one of their crimes, or they're identified by a surviving victim. But in the case of Baumeister, it was one of his own family members who led to his undoing. Baumeister and his wife Julie met in Indianapolis in 1967 when he was attending Indiana University. They dated for 4 years and in 1971 decided to get married. He started working at the State Bureau of Motor Vehicles, where he was considered to be somewhat of a perfectionist who took pride in his job, but who would fly into fits of rage over trivial matters. He eventually decided to leave his job, and instead he opened several secondhand stores called Save-A-Lots. The first of the stores opened in 1989, and initially it did very well, but soon enough he found himself in financial trouble as the stores started struggling. This had a negative effect on his marriage, and by 1991 he filed for divorce and moved out of the couple's home. He and Julie decided to try again later that year, and in November they decided to purchase a property called Fox Hollow Farm. Less than 2 years later, Indiana would be gripped by a mystery as men started disappearing, never to be seen again. When Alan Wayne Broussard and Roger Allen Goodlett went missing, their families contacted a private investigator in hopes that he would be able to figure out what happened to them. It became apparent that the men who had disappeared were homosexual, and so the investigator traveled to bars in the area, handing out flyers containing the missing men's information. That's when the reality of the situation became clear, as people started reporting that even more men were simply vanishing without a trace. One man came forward to report that he'd met a man named Brian who took him to an estate and attempted to end his life, but he managed to get away. In the meantime, Baumeister's son arrived home one day, carrying a skull that he had found on the property. Baumeister claimed that he knew of the skull and that it had been buried on the property by his father, who was an anesthesiologist. Several more bones were found, but he claimed that they were part of the same medical school skeleton, and there was no need for alarm. But unbeknownst to Baumeister, the man who had escaped his attack had taken down his car's license plate and had handed it to the police. When he was confronted over the incident, he refused to let the police search his property. But investigators were also speaking to Julie in an effort to convince her that Baumeister was a serial killer. She refused to believe them, but over time she started to have doubts over her husband's innocence. And in June of 1996, she gave the police permission to search the farm while Baumeister was out. To their horror, investigators found human remains scattered all over the property, and it became clear that Baumeister was indeed guilty. Before they could make contact with him, though, he fled to Canada, where he lost his life. As search efforts on the farm continued, it was revealed that Baumeister had ended the lives of at least 10 men between 1993 and 1995. Most of his victims were eventually identified, but at least 3 remain unknown. Number 4. Most serial killers commit their crimes over a span of several years, but Gary Ray Bowles' spree lasted just 9 months, though his crimes were no less gruesome. When Bowles was born in Clifton Forge, Virginia, in 1962, his father had already passed away, and during his childhood, his mother remarried several times. One of his stepfathers was a violent alcoholic who would regularly assault him and his mother, as well as his older brother. On one occasion, when he was 13, Bowles had had enough of the abuse, and when his stepfather started assaulting him again, he struck back and severely injured him. When his mother revealed that she'd be staying married to the man, Bowles became outraged and left the home. For several years, he lived on the streets and on occasion would make money as a street worker. He spent some time in prison after he was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, but was released in 1991. But he was soon back in prison after stealing a woman's handbag and served a further 2 years. In 1994, his crime took a far more sinister turn when he started targeting homosexual men in Florida. His first victim was John Hardy Roberts, with whom he was staying for a while. The two men got into an argument, during which Bowles assaulted him and ended his life. He was named a suspect after his fingerprints were found at the scene, but since he lived in the building, this wasn't enough proof that he was the culprit. Over the next few months, he would frequent bars where he would meet his victims before ending their lives. These crimes occurred in Daytona Beach, Jacksonville, and Hillard in Florida, Savannah and Atlanta in Georgia, as well as Wheaton in Maryland. Bowles was placed on the FBI's most wanted list after it was determined that he was responsible for ending the lives of at least 4 men. He was eventually tracked down and taken into custody, and under questioning, he confessed to ending the lives of 6 men, one of whom was Walter Hinton, who'd asked Bowles to help him move from Georgia to Jacksonville. Hinton told him that if he helped, he'd allow him to stay with him in his mobile home for a while, and Bowles agreed. But one night, the 2 men returned home after dropping a friend off at a train station, and Hinton decided to go to bed. Bowles, though, became intoxicated, and according to him, at some point just snapped. He got a large concrete block from outside and used it to assault Hinton, who was fast asleep at the time. The 2 men struggled, but Bowles eventually got the upper hand and ended his life. He then confessed to ending a man's life after they got into a physical fight outside of a bar, and ending the life of another in Volusia County. He was eventually found guilty in 1999 and sentenced to be executed. This sentence was overturned at one point, but when further evidence was presented, it was reinstated. Number 3. As with so many serial killers, Gary Dean Artman had a history with the law when he was finally identified. He was sentenced to 11 years behind bars in 1980, after he was found guilty of assaulting a woman and threatening to end her life. He was released in 1992, but just 4 years later, he would start committing even more horrific crimes that would take a very long time to solve. On the 3rd of October, 1996, the body of Sharon Hammock was found in Kent County, Michigan. It was quickly determined she'd been attacked and tied up before her life was ended. Her attacker then rolled her body up in a carpet and left her by the side of the road in the area where a delivery driver made the horrific discovery. But Sharon was just one of many women who'd gone missing in the Grand Rapids area during the 1990s. Investigators were busy looking into at least 8 more similar cases, and in the years that followed, 3 more women would be found deceased after being attacked. When investigators delved into the lives of these women, it was found that most of them had some things in common, including the fact that they were struggling with addiction and that they had, at times, been employed as street workers. By the end of 1996, 12 murders were being investigated, and it was suggested that a serial killer may be operating in the area. A task force was formed, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any suspects. In 2 of these cases, the police were able to collect DNA samples from the crime scene, and after analysis, it was determined that the same person had committed the crimes, but there was no way of identifying them, as their DNA had not been added to the national database. Nevertheless, thanks to the familial genealogy, investigators were able to narrow their search down to 4 people who were all related. Only one of those people, Gary Artman, had any ties to Michigan. Artman had been working in the area at the time that the attack took place. It was also discovered that one of the victims was in Ontario, California, shortly before she was found deceased, and that Artman was in the same area at that time. When these crimes were committed, Artman was working as a long-haul trucker, and this would have given him the perfect opportunity to carry out these deeds without being suspected, since he would only be in one given area for a short time before moving on. He was implicated in ending the life of Dusty Suck, a woman from Maryland, after his DNA was found at the scene. But by that time, Artman was suffering from lung cancer, which made his trial difficult. He'd slipped into a coma and was breathing with the aid of a respirator. It was doubtful he'd ever wake up, and hence would likely never face justice for his crimes. But he suddenly emerged from the coma one day and stated he needed to confess to something. He told investigators that he did indeed end the life of Dusty Suck, but added that he'd also attacked and ended the lives of a further 11 women during the 1990s. Investigators are continuing to look into other missing person reports from that time to determine whether he had more victims. Number 2. Ivan Milat is still considered to be one of Australia's most notorious serial killers, even years after he passed away. He was born Ivan Robert Marko Milat in December of 1945 and was one of 14 children in his family's home. His father was a Croatian immigrant who worked on the wharves in Sydney, and his mother stayed home to look after their children in the house. The family would eventually move to Moorebank in Sydney, where his father planted tomatoes on their property and where the 10 brothers were put to work. According to those who knew the family, they didn't stand out in any particular way. But as Milat grew older, he started committing crimes such as burglary, and before long he was known to the police in the area. While a few of his brothers also got in trouble with the law, Milat decided he enjoyed a life of crime, and unlike his siblings, decided to make a career of it. He was arrested for burglary and breaking and entering on several occasions, but as the years went by, his crimes became ever more serious. In the 1970s, he attacked a woman in Melbourne after picking her up while she was hitchhiking. Though he was acquitted in that case, in 1989, Deborah Everest and James Gibson left Melbourne to attend an alternative lifestyle festival, but their friends reported them as missing when they didn't arrive. According to some sources, the police didn't take the report too seriously, and not much was done about it. In 1999, Simone Schmidl was reported missing after failing to meet her mother at the airport in Melbourne. And that same year, Gabor Neugebauer and Anya Habschied disappeared while traveling to Darwin from Sydney. Carolyn Clark and James Gibson, who hailed from Wales in the UK, were sharing an apartment in King's Cross in Sydney, but they often hitchhiked to other parts of the country. And in 1992, they were headed to either Perth or Victoria when they suddenly disappeared. When their families started contacting media outlets about their disappearances, reporters started speculating that these disappearances were linked. In September of 1992, 2 joggers came across the remains of Carolyn and James, and the next year, the bodies of James Gibson and Deborah Everest. Just a month later, 3 more bodies were found, and it was determined that they were all attacked by the same person, since the modus operandi was similar. A few suspects were identified and questioned, but Milat's fate was sealed when a man named Paul Onions came forward to report that Milat had attacked him with the intention of ending his life, but he managed to escape. He stated that he was hitchhiking to Canberra when Milat picked him up. At first, nothing seemed suspicious, but at some point during the journey, Milat started asking strange questions, such as how many people knew where he was headed and whether anyone was waiting for him in Canberra. Milat then pulled over and attacked Onions, but he made it out of the car and flagged down a passing motorist, which caused Milat to flee. Milat's house was searched in 1994, and items belonging to his victims were found, after which he was arrested. He was taken to a maximum security prison while his trial was ongoing, but after being transferred to Sydney, he was diagnosed with esophageal and stomach cancer. He also went on several hunger strikes, and on occasion would threaten to harm himself if his demands weren't met by prison guards. He was eventually found guilty of these crimes and handed 7 life sentences, and he passed away on the 27th of October, 2019, still maintaining that he was innocent. Number 1. It's always sad to hear about a horrific crime that was committed, but it's even worse when that crime was completely unnecessary, as was the case in the incident that claimed the life of 34-year-old Jessica Lal in 1999. Her attacker was a man named Manu Sharma, who's the son of an influential Indian Congress Party politician in Haryana, India. At the time, Jessica was working as a model, but to make extra money, she had taken a job as a celebrity barmaid at a party that was being held in Delhi. The night had gone off without a hitch, but that changed at around 2 a.m. when Sharma and a few of his friends walked into the bar and demanded that Jessica serve them drinks, despite the establishment already being closed for the night. She informed him that they would not be able to drink there, a decision that was by no means made by Jessica, and they would have to go elsewhere to find alcohol. But Sharma refused to accept this, and he started arguing with her. It's believed that he was already intoxicated when he arrived at the bar, which further exacerbated the situation. Finally, after flying into a rage, Sharma produced a firearm and fired into the air once before aiming the weapon at Jessica and pulling the trigger. Several witnesses who were present would report to investigators that they watched the incident unfold, and there was no doubt that Sharma was responsible for ending Jessica's life. No one had expected him to act in such a harsh and dramatic way, since the argument was merely about being served drinks, but the reality was that Jessica was no longer alive, and that Sharma was the one responsible. He immediately fled the scene, and for the next 7 days, the police searched for him without any success. The Delhi Police Joint Commissioner was also present at the party, but was not at that bar when the incident occurred. A week later, Sharma finally decided he'd had enough of evading the law, and he handed himself over to the police. He stated that he remembered the incident, but that he didn't recognize Jessica, and that he initially discharged his weapon once into the air. He then aimed it at her but intended to fire past her to scare her. He pulled the trigger and, according to him, remembered hitting someone, but was unaware that he had ended Jessica's life. He added that he lost his temper after Jessica told him that even if he paid 1,000 rupees, she would not serve him a drink. When he was told that he had ended Jessica's life, he decided to flee. He threw his firearm into a nearby garden and got a lift from someone on a scooter. He then got rides in a car and a tractor, and when he finally reached one of his friends' houses, he was told that Jessica had lost her life. Sharma's version of events aligned with witness statements, and he was arrested. The trial was plagued by bribery and false witness statements, but Sharma was eventually found guilty and ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison. 2 of his friends who were present that night were each handed 4-year sentences after they destroyed crucial evidence in an effort to deceive the police. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.